Hi.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this first ever Idea Process product panel on creativity and innovation, hosted by the UIS Music Program and NPR Illinois. I want to thank leadership in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as leadership in the Chancellor's Office at UIS for helping to make these events possible. And I will thank each of our panelists in order as I introduce them a bit later on. I have a short introduction that I would like to read to sort of set the stage for what this panel is going to be. And after I get through that, I will introduce our panelists and we will get started. So, in his study of the concept of genius in Western classical music, the possessor and the possessed, Peter Kivy describes two popular archetypes of the creative musician. On the one hand, there is Mozartian creativity. The vision of a completed creative product is transmitted from a divine source, fully formed and instantaneously into the mind of the creator. All the work has been done by the divine ahead of time. What remains to be done is for the human creator to write it all down. On the other hand, there's the popular image of Beethoven, working slowly and with great effort, laboring for hours over a single idea, searching for the perfect way to express the inexpressible, and always struggling. Yet, when the work is done, it's considered to be no less divinely inspired than a work by Mozart. What seemed a great human labor was just the divine speaking through its chosen human vessel. In short, Mozart is the possessor and Beethoven is the possessed. This framing forces discussions of creativity in classical music into a dead end. The question, how does one create, can only be answered with, be a genius who is in touch with the divine. The question, what if I'm not a genius who's in touch with the divine, can only be answered with, then don't create. I think the fetishization of genius is more pronounced in the arts than in other domains. We don't think of Jeff Bezos as communing with the muses of commerce, or Marie Curie communing with the muses of physics and chemistry. Yet the formidable creative accomplishments of these figures, and so many others, still seem mysterious. We find ourselves looking at their work and wondering, how did they do that? In preparation for this discussion, I shared with the panelists a definition of creativity I find to be much more conducive to conversation than one centered on the divine. I think this definition also sheds light on why creativity can seem so mysterious. I'd like to share it with the audience while stressing that it may or may not be in line with each of our panelists' own definition of creativity, or yours as an audience member. So this definition comes from a book that was originally called The Social Psychology of Creativity and has since been renamed in a new edition, Creativity in Context, by Teresa Amabile, who's on faculty in the Harvard Business School. And so this is the definition of creativity she offers that I shared with our panelists. She says, a product or response will be judged as creative to the extent that A, it is both a novel and appropriate, useful, correct, or valuable response to the task at hand, and B, the task is heuristic rather than algorithmic. She goes on to define these terms in a way that's quite helpful for understanding. She says, algorithmic tasks are those for which the path to the solution is clear and straightforward, tasks for which an algorithm exists. Heuristic tasks are those not having a clear and readily identifiable path to solution, tasks for which algorithms must be developed. Path to solution refers to that set of cognitive and motor operations that will lead to an acceptable response or product in the domain of endeavor. So creativity here is defined by the extent to which the created product is new and valuable, and the extent to which the creator had to find their own way to completing it. It's not divine intervention that guides creation. Rather, the product or solution cannot exist before the creator herself forges a path to discover it. The result of this new series of actions, what Amabile refers to as, quote, cognitive and motor operations, is a new product. To me, this seems a much more inviting view of creativity, and one we have all likely experienced, even if we were not aware of it at the time. Each of our panelists has created something that, in their domain of expertise, is recognized as new and valuable. A film, a business, knowledge through research, improvised music. And each has done so through a series of actions that were to some extent heuristic rather than algorithmic. Beginning with a discussion of ideas and ideation, the talk will progress through a discussion of the process through which an initial idea becomes a final product. Finally, we will conclude by thinking about what it means to finish a creative work. And so now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and we will get underway. Dr. Haiqi Chan received his PhD degree in physics from Yale University. His early work focused on mathematical physics, particularly on differential equations in quantum field theory. In recent years, his main research interests are in Q-series and mathematics inspired by Indian mathematical genius Srinivasa Ramanujan. He's the author of An Invitation to Q-series published by World Scientific Publishing. Dr. Ranjan Kari is professor of strategic management and entrepreneurship in the College of Business and Management at the University of Illinois Springfield. He teaches strategic management, organization theory, international management, entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurial finance. His research interests are in the areas of entrepreneurship, business, ethics, and strategic management. He's particularly interested in entrepreneurial cognition and behavior. He's published in top-tier journals such as Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, Entrepreneurship and Regional Development, the Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Small Business Management, and Journal of Management Education. He's also published in practitioner journals such as Business Horizons and Organizational Dynamics. Amy Lockhart is a filmmaker, animator, and artist. Her animations have screened at festivals nationally and internationally, including the British Film Institute of New York, Anthology Film Archives, Ann Arbor Film Festival, Carnegie Mellon, and International Animation Festival in Hiroshima, Japan. Her drawings, comics, and paintings have been published by Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, and by Color Code. She's assistant professor of film and animation at DePaul University, and you can learn more about her at amylockhart.ca. Dr. Jonas Stamatis is associate professor of ethnomusicology and director of the UIS music program. Her research focus is on Rebetiko music in contemporary Greece, with special attention to music as a vehicle for social change. Her research has been supported by numerous grants, including a Fulbright Award, a Mellon Fellowship, and a Sangadas Fellowship. Currently, she is completing work on 2 book chapters, one on musical commemorations of Greek war heroine Bouboulina, and another on music as a tool of political socialization during early adolescence. She plays violin with the Illinois Symphony Orchestra and produces special arts coverage for NPR Illinois. So those are our esteemed panelists. And with that introduction, I would like to thank them ahead of time for the contribution they're about to make. And I would like to get started. So the first question I would like to ask focuses on ideas. And what I'd like to do is read the question as I presented it to each of the panelists, while giving a note to the audience that the panelists may not necessarily speak on these questions exactly as they are worded. I have given them full freedom to sort of explore the topic in general, if they didn't feel that the questions as I posed them were very effective for their own creative process. So the first question, and we'll start with Dr. Stamatis on this one, is: the literature on creativity identifies the idea as the starting point of any creative endeavor. Please talk about an idea you had in the past that eventually resulted in a finished product. Focusing on the moment of ideation rather than the development of the idea through later work, please speak on the following questions. What was the idea? When and how did it come to you? What did it feel like to have this idea? Did you recognize it as an idea in the moment? Where do you think this idea came from?
All right, so thank you very much, Adam, for organizing this panel and for coming up with such a fascinating interdisciplinary approach to creativity. Starting off this panel, I will speak to your question, but probably at something of a bit of an angle. So can you see my PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So what was the idea? Well, I'm a musician. I'm trained as a classical violinist, but over the past 15 years or so, I have devoted my attention to largely to Greek folk music, and specifically to a genre of music called Rebetiko. And Rebetiko is an urban popular song style that arose about 100 years ago, featuring instruments like the bouzouki that you see pictured here. And one of its most salient characteristics is improvisation. And so in music, improvisation is when a performer creates new music on demand, in the moment, on the spot, in front of an audience for an extended period of time. And in Rebetiko music, you're expected to do this constantly. You know, whether you're playing a song that was written by someone else, there's the expectation that you're somehow going to make it your own. But even more significantly, you're expected to play what is called taksimi. And a taksimi is, you know, an extended musical improvisation. It might be a standalone piece, or it might be a moment where the music stops and everybody turns towards you and kind of waits for you to make this unbelievable moment of musical beauty and creativity. And so I don't know if there's time. I'd love to play just maybe 15 seconds of a very good Rebetiko musician playing one of these taksimi, so that you can have an idea of this sound world. So give me a moment just to pull up that screen. And here it is. His name is Grigoris Vasilas. You'll see the bouzouki player here on the right. Just listen to a few moments. All right. So you're expected to be able to do this in Rebetiko, you know, quite well and constantly and sort of on demand in the moment. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today isn't about one specific creative idea that I've had and nourished through completion, but rather I'd like to talk about my process of learning how to be sort of continuously creative, how to improvise on demand, as you know, as is required of a burgeoning Rebetiko musician. You know, needless to say, as a classical violinist, improvisation was not part of my training at all. I spent much of my life in the practice room, you know, perfecting my interpretation of music that was written by other people, by the creative geniuses that Adam mentioned earlier, like Mozart, who just, you know, was said to have heard in his mind entire symphonies and would have to rush to find a piece of paper to write them down so that he wouldn't lose this great moment of genius. And of course, I'm certainly not a creative genius of this kind. And so the question was, could this kind of musical creativity be learned as an adult? Could I learn to come up with ideas that were good, that held water kind of on the spot and in front of an audience? And if so, you know, how? And what I learned is that, yeah, it is possible. And I learned a lot about my own creative process on the way. And I think the most important lesson that I learned from my earliest attempts at improvisation is that I can't just go in with, you know, an open heart and an open mind and come up with good ideas. You know, creativity isn't merely about sort of free thought and free association and waiting for sudden musical inspiration. I had to work to learn how to get myself into a creative mindset on demand. And that's something I'll talk more about to respond to Adam's second question that's coming later. But I learned that I needed to embrace what I call constructive constraints. In other words, you know, new ideas, whether they come in sort of a flash of inspiration or whether they come through hard work, New ideas are always constrained in some way by conventions, by implicit rules, by perceptions of what we're doing and why we're doing it, by what other people have done. And so I think to be creative, to come up with a new idea, we have to embrace these constraints as empowering, as giving form and context and direction to any new idea we might have. And so what does this mean musically? Well, musically, I can't just sit down and string together a random series of notes and call that my improvisation. That wouldn't have any kind of organizational logic for me or for my audience. It would really have no meaning. And the wrong organizational logic would mean that my improvisation might come out in bluegrass style or in the style of a Mozart cadenza. So, and perhaps this is a really simple realization, but it was the revelation that I needed to unleash my own creativity and to begin to improvise appropriately and well. And so to me, embracing constraints meant above all that I had to amass enough knowledge about Rebetiko performance. It had to be so secure, so sound, that I not only found myself sort of living and breathing Rebetiko music, but that I had this kind of an arsenal of musical ideas, of musical phrases, of rules, of ornaments, of timbres, this kind of like a stockroom of musical elements that I could draw upon in the moment, and then kind of put them together in endless new ways to create as many improvisations as I needed, and that could last as long as I needed them to. So, to summarize briefly, I guess what I came to understand is that in order for me to enter a mode of continuous creativity on demand, I need to be both completely submerged in the world of Rebetiko, living, thinking, breathing the music, but I also need to put in very deliberate hard work. New ideas, new musical ideas, they don't emerge from thin air, even for Mozart. Mozart worked really, really, really hard learning counterpoint and studying the piano and studying music that other people had written. So they emerged from someone who's really, really, well-versed in their field. And so I'll pause there for now, and then in the next section, jump into the kind of psychological tricks I use to enter a mode of creativity.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I this idea of needing to be submerged in the work in order to have ideas about it is one that I think is really interesting. I'd love to know if any of our other panelists have had a same experience, that once you become more familiar, or the more familiar you become with your domain of knowledge, that ideas come more easily. Ranjan, would you mind speaking next on this? It'd be interesting to hear a contrast from the music world to the business world.
Sure, but actually, I just want to say something about music, a little bit. I grew up in southern part of India, and that music genre is called classical music, is called Carnatic music. And there is a term called manodharma. Manodharma means imagination. And that is a critical component of any rendering of a particular raga, as they call it, the tune, which could be authored by somebody as famous as Mozart, but your rendering should improvise based on that. That's when you become a noted artist. And what they say is that novices cannot do that. You have to have a lot of practice and a lot of depth. So from here, I'll move on to what I think is creativity or idea, is that ideas can be novel and they have to be useful. When you say they have to be useful, then somebody has to receive that idea as new, right? Now, it is not just about your own knowledge that could constrain, but it is others' knowledge that could constrain them from perceiving your improvisation, right? Or your creativity. So what the Carnatic music emphasizes is that you have to follow the rules and stray from the rules just enough to show your improvisation that others can appreciate, right? And over time, maybe you can come up with your own style, essentially, So that constant practice has to be important, is very important. So ideas don't just pop up in your head. When somebody says an idea popped up, well, it's just like a dream or some notion that you got. It has to be crafted. So it has to be developed. And that crafting, and I use the word crafting, means you're talking about small little things, painstaking efforts to communicate the idea to others. So when I come up with ideas, so my research, I like to think of creativity as combining concepts that seem to clash in the first go. So when you look at, I mean, there are a lot of examples like affordability and luxury, right? Affordable luxuries. These kind of concepts make a lot of creative impacts. So for example, they say that the entrepreneurs and businessmen essentially are highly controlling. They have a lot of confidence, and they have very little trust about others. So I said, okay, what if we think of entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs are the ones who trust too much, are naive. Does naivety actually improve their success rate in their ability to think? And turns out, theoretically, you can actually argue that if you are not naive, then lacking naivety creates lots of obstacles to come up with a new idea. So when people say they're savants or gifted individuals, right, especially gifted children, they are not constrained by existing knowledge, essentially. And that's why they can come up with something that you think it is creative. So I believe that people who are doing research, all faculty as academics, we are essentially creative people. At least sometimes it's dormant, sometimes we forget and we just follow the rules. So if you can challenge yourself and communicate others how that challenge is interesting and beneficial, that's when you have a creative idea. Otherwise, it's just an idea, So the other thing that I wanted to say was that a lot of times when people perceive creativity is when you employ what I call analogical reasoning. So whether it's music or painting or even writing, when you think in terms of analogies, that's when people will start perceiving your ideas as truly creative. They're not just novel, but I can see why that is new. There are a lot of examples, whether it is Amazon or whether it is Warby Parker. You should read a book called by Adam Grant. He talks about Warby Parker, the thing that everybody uses for hundreds of years. This thing has never changed, glasses. And yet we start paying a lot of money, right? Because we started accepting the rules of insurance and all of that stuff. Similarly, when we work in our own areas, we tend not to push the boundaries. So if you don't push the boundaries, then you can never be creative. And I'll talk a little bit later for your other questions.
Thank you so much. What's really interesting is that I'm hearing we're talking about constraints and boundaries in two different ways, right? So that we need constraints in some way to be creative, but then also you have to be willing to step outside them when the time is right. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. So essentially, whether your knowledge or your field, do you view it as a bridge or whether you view it as a fence? So if you view it as a fence, then you're not letting anybody else come in and you're just in a silo. You have these ideas. But if you view it as a bridge, then suddenly new things will happen.
Thanks so much. Amy, can you talk to us about the concept of ideas in your work?
Yes, constraints is a great way to go into mine. So I was thinking of ideas, and most of my ideas I get are problem solving. So I'm drawn to, as Yona is as well, to constraints and sort of needing that thing to work against or within. And a lot of them will be from commissions or some prompts that maybe from the outside world that I get. One example I'll show you is kind of a fun example was I was working on a 10-minute film, Walk for Walk, with a bunch of characters walking, no dialogue, lots of little sound effects. And then I wanted to record very small sounds of toys and beads and stuff like that, where you really have to turn up the gain so you can hear everything. I tried it in my apartment, but it picked up all of the ambient sounds of the neighbors taking a bath, the computer, that sort of thing. So that became my problem that I needed to solve. And then I looked up just how to deal with that and found out about Isolation Box, creating an Isolation Box, which is basically creating a little mini sound studio in my apartment, basically. And then it just became this very goal oriented. I want to create this thing. I come from a very DIY approach, so I'm coming to it with cheap materials, accessible materials, sort of figuring it out on myself instead of hiring someone. And so it was just great. I love this idea of just having a problem that leads you, a goal that leads you, and then it sets up sort of materials. It makes all these little decisions in these categories that you have to make, and then you can sort of figure it out within that. So I'll just show you this goofy little box I made. This is the box. Do you see that full screen? All right. Anywho, so here it is in an old apartment I lived in. I ended up creating it out of layers of cardboard and drywall that's made for soundproofing. So a lot of it was finding soft materials that didn't transmit vibrations, and then creating layers of dead air in between it. So I'd have sort of a firm material, a soft firm material, insulation, dead air, another layer of that, and building it up. And then it was, again, like where to find these materials, where to get them cheaply, that sort of thing. So this is the box here. This is the entranceway that you go into. You lift it up, and then it had this sort of block that you close the door in, and then here's a little mic that led outside to a recording device. It was very small. There was no air circulation. I even had a small child in there once doing voices, and we could only stay for a short amount of time because she was running out of air. And then here's just that typical, I got egg cartons from an egg seller in the market where I was living. And then here's a Pro Tools box with a little mic, not a very great stand, but again, it's that sort of finding inspiration in being cheap and being innovative sort of thing. This is a little plexiglass window. It's double paned with a bit of dead air in between. And then I laced the cables through, so that's an old mouse. And then on the other side, it's me in there playing some instruments. Normally the door would be closed. And then I would look through this window from the inside out, from the outside in. And then very young here. And then I was actually using my computer to record it, but normally I would have the computer propped up on a drum right there. And that is it. Yeah, so short and sweet, but yeah, so a lot of it just comes from like the fun of trying to create a lot with a little sort of thing.
Thanks so much.
Cool. Can I stop my screen share?
Hey, Chi, you know, it's some kind of interesting to think of creativity in a field like mathematics, because we usually think of the hard science as discovering truths that are already out there in nature. What role do ideas play in your research?
I want to show you this picture. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint for you guys. Well, Adam, firstly, your poster is really good. Did you design it?
No, but my wife designed it.
It's a great poster. It's safe all for me, because I'm just like this. And you know, creativity for me is I want to, you know, find a new path and walk a new path. And when I hear all the panelists saying, I feel so, you know, it's exactly the feel the same way, because most of the time when I think about, new ideas, create new ideas, I try to let, I try to immerse myself in some great ideas by other people and try to let those ideas to inspire me to find that path. And so that's why I usually wandering around just like that ants, okay? But when I look at this poster, hey, that's me. That's the way I meet creativity. I meet new ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd love to transition to the next phase of this talk because we still have much to get through. So the next question that I have posed to our panelists, and again, I'll just reiterate that I intended these questions to be a sort of a loose guide for our panelists to think about. When we're talking about creative process, it's very personal thing, right? So it's almost difficult to ask someone questions about their process because you don't, in a sense, you don't know the language that they communicate with themselves about their creative process. So the next section is all about the kind of work that needs to be done on an idea to bring it to fruition. And so I'll read the question as I stated it to the panelists, and they can interpret it as they wish. And Hei-Chi, we'll start with you on this one since you went last on the one before. So the next question is, an idea is just an idea until someone does the work to bring it to fruition. Yet, as I am sure you all know, part of bringing an idea to fruition is the expectation the idea will evolve as it encounters reality on the ground. Please talk about how you go about bringing an idea to fruition. How do your ideas change as you start to work on them, and why? During the process of creation, how sure are you of where you're going? At any moment, how sure are you that you are making something that will end up as part of the final product? How do you know what is good or what works in the moment of creation?
Well, just like that ant in the poster, I want to add to this book too. I don't know if you guys have read this book, Lemuel the Fool. Oh, okay. It's about a guy who he is a fisherman. He want to see the world. So one day he jumped into his boat and leave his wife and his kid, and he just travel, and the book said, well, according to the book, that night when he left town, he was it was met with high wind. He was being tormented by the wave. Now, part of the process to bring an idea to fruition, I think this picture really speaks to it. It's a lot of torment. It's a lot of unsure. Your question asks, how can I be sure, where am I going? Just like this picture, I'm not sure most of the time. And what is so funny about this story is that the next day, he end up in a place he feel like is the enchanted village. And he was shocked by it because he feel like, oh, it looks exactly the same as my village. And he even met a woman look exactly like his wife. During that process, Adam, in doing research in math, many times I feel like the same, worse than that ant looking around places, I feel like, I'm always tumbling between uncertainty, not sure, things are not sure, but as I age, another way of saying I'm getting old, I think I'm getting a little bit better. I'm getting a little bit better because of experience, because the experience of dealing with unknowns, setbacks, is a mental thing, and also during that process, as learn more tools. More tools help me to figure out what's the next step. And I guess one thing that process is thrilling, especially when I was young. I didn't know as much as I do now. So over the year, I learned to diversify my portfolio. I work on difficult problems that I may never finish. I also work on some easier problems, and it's a mindset thing. But it's a good book. It's a good book.
Thanks for sharing. It's what's interesting is thinking about this idea that your process changes as your familiarity with your domain becomes more sophisticated. Do you feel like there's ever a point where you'll figure out like the best process to use? Like, will you ever learn enough about your field to know exactly what you should be doing all the time?
I wish I know. But I guess that's a fun part, it's a fun part of being creative, because there's some unknown, some surprise there. And of course, some surprise is good. And it depends on how much surprise one can take. Okay. So I don't think I will ever know the perfect path. If I know, I will let you know.
Thanks. Amy, you talked a lot about this idea of sort of like experimenting with materials and sort of finding your way forward through doing that. Does this resonate with you, this idea that as you become more familiar with your work, that your process evolves too?
Totally. And I would say to the water and sailing analogy, it's a lot like surfing. So it's not like I necessarily can figure out what I'm doing right away faster. I just am kinder to myself, and I'm better at that sort of surfing and creating that creative space, and just being kind and understanding and mature in my emotional relationship with myself, in a sense. And I feel like a lot of creativity is this idea of, excuse my language, but puking out a bunch of ideas, letting them sit for a minute, and then going back and combing over and finding the golden nuggets. So creating that sort of space where you can do the only thing you can do as an individual is like let yourself be the best you. It's a corny language, but it's like getting away from trying to live up to and defer to other authorities and ideas of things, and just give yourself that space to create stuff and not overthink it, which is I found has been like the biggest challenge and like a lifelong challenge. But yeah, I've sort of gone into it where I've created different modes and really embraced different modes, where I'm like, okay, now I'm just gonna sit here and make a bunch of drawings, and again create some kind of limitation, whether it's like, I was gonna talk about this comic I did where you can kind of see it anyways, where through that I created sort of a visual language, a kind of like paradigm or mindset, like an absurdist way of talking, and then that created a limitation I worked through, and then I just try to let creativity flow through that and not take it personal. You know what I mean? Just it's almost like a muscle, or like some you're linking into something bigger and letting it flow through you. Yeah, and same with it's one thing I just really developed over the pandemic with drawing, because I just needed some art therapy, and I love pencil crayon. It's very relaxing. So I just, had a certain set of materials, I, had my paper, and I would just draw in passes sort of thing, and not judge myself. Just do it, be in that mode, and really try. If I got too much in my head, I needed to take a break, but it was just like about practicing that way of just relaxing into it and letting it happen. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about this?
Yeah.
I love this idea of like puking out as many things as you can.
Yeah.
And then from what you have puked out, choose the things that are valuable. So, so what do you do with the rest of it? Like, do you just throw it away, or don't you feel in a sense like you've created art and like it shouldn't just be thrown away, or is that part of the process?
I think that's part of it, but I do end up usually I end up just working on it more until I get to that final point. But it is also allowing that space for like, oh, I can do bad work sort of thing, and that's okay. But I feel like maybe because I'm a bit of a hoarder, I don't know, I don't throw out that much, so I'm like, I can use this, I can use that. Yeah, no, I was just talking with another artist today, sorry, and they were talking about Zen Buddhism. I guess this is like an idea around creativity, sorry, this idea of creating compost, and out of compost like sprouts grow sort of thing. So you have to, in a sense, just create a bunch of stuff, and some of it you will throw out, but within that you all sort of, oh my God, sort of create the opportunity for good golden nuggets.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Ranjan, does any of this resonate with your understanding of how entrepreneurship works? Is there a sort of understanding that in the work of building a venture, say, that you're going to do things that won't end up in the actual venture itself? Is there this idea of like throwing things up and then just seeing what's there and picking the best parts?
Yeah, I think that's what Columbus did. You know, he thought he's going to India, but he ended up in America and started calling everybody out here Indians. You know, so in other words, all journeys, creative journeys, are fraught with uncertainties. If there's no uncertainty, then it's algorithmic, right? So something, it's a routine essentially. But I would like to say that creative people, or at least people who are in the process of creation, they're unlike gamblers. They don't risk too much. They take small steps that may end up in a loss, but that loss they can afford, right? And that is very important. So when Amy was saying something that, I'll throw something, I'll do something, I'll do some trip, try different things, but she's not selling her house about that. She's constructing stuff with materials that she has in control. She has them. So in other words, she's not thinking that, hey, I need to buy stuff to be creative. Start with what you have. And the vision is always evolving. So if you know the end point, then it's not a creative pursuit fundamentally, essentially. So I come up with an idea for a paper, but the actual paper may be totally different. Why? Because I'm not only talking to myself about the idea, and of course, it's not a very good idea if you just talk to yourself. It's good to talk to yourself to make it clear in your own head, but you have to talk to others. When you talk to others, that is when the collaborative process will lead you into different directions. So your idea could be poo-pooed right away, so you have to have a thick skin, of course. But then that has to be the motivation to enlarge or expand or move, even pivot completely to something else. And that, I think, is fundamental for any creative process. Creatives are not stubborn. They're very flexible. The thinking has to be very flexible. They're divergent. They can put opposites together. They don't have huge egos, even though sometimes we think that these gifted people have egos, because their egos have been busted in the process of their creation so many times. They may put up a persona like that sometimes, and other famous musicians and all this stuff, but actually they are really humble people, naive people.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Actually, that's a great transition to go back to Yona, who's talking about musical improvisation, because one of the things that fascinates me about improvisation, I'm not a great improviser, but the times that I do it, is that you kind of start, and oftentimes you don't know when it's going to end or how. And so I wonder, what is it like learning to improvise and dealing with the fact that there might not be a natural endpoint to what you're doing?
I'm glad that you transitioned well to me, not because you think I have a very big ego, but because it's about improvisation. That's such a great question. And I think it's something that I discovered along the way about Rebetiko improvisation, is that it's not as unknown as one might think. And I think that's actually how I deal with it. There's actually some kind of a creative mapping that takes place beforehand, and I'm sort of following that guide and improvising off of that. So yeah, I would be terrified to just to go into the unknown in that way. And I was really glad to think about this question and kind of force myself into thinking about my creative process and how it works. How I transform these musical ideas. I as I ended before, I have this sort of stockpile of musical knowledge, and now I have to figure out a way to sit down and enter on command my zone of creativity and create. And so I discovered a few things I wanted to share with you, really four basic steps that I kind of take took to sort of become more successful at improvising. The very first thing was I realized I had to commit myself really fully to this project. I had to commit myself to working on improvisation every single day, no matter my mood or no matter what else was happening in my life. To quote the famous psychologist, I have a famous quotation here, Jerome Bruner, you're more likely to act yourself into feeling than to feel yourself into action. And I think there's something about, sitting down and working on an improvisation every single day, no matter the circumstances, that helps me learn to turn on my creative mode at any time. And it's really, really helpful because, you know, you're in a performance and you might not be in the mood that day to be creative or to perform, but you still have to produce. So practicing acting myself into feeling creative, I think is really, really key. Second, you know, developing confidence in my own musical ideas was also really key. Learning to understand, accept, you know, I'm not Mozart, but the ideas that I have, the musical ideas I have, they're valuable and they're beautiful and they're worth being heard. And, you know, as Rangan said, developing the confidence to proudly offer ideas that are not very good. And, you know, I can't expect every idea that I have to be great and for people to recognize the ones that are good or not. You know, if that's the focus, then I won't produce anything. And so I think I needed to work on creating a mindset that said, it's okay if you try out new ideas. Yeah, I'm kind of safe, as Rangan said. I'm not going to try something crazy, some kind of pyrotechnics that I don't think I can handle in front of people. But and also accept that, you know, some are going to work and some are not, and that's okay. The other thing I sort of realized about myself is that I needed to find a way to mentally be absolutely present, you know, here and now. That somehow I need to find a way to clear out and block distractions. And that's actually very, very hard for me. I'm always sort of thinking about, oh, who's that person? What are they wearing? What are they thinking? You know, oh, they just entered the room. And it takes a lot of work for me to be very, very present. You know, if I'm thinking about tomorrow or the audience or something, I can't, I won't produce well. You know, I included that famous quotation from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you know, where he's talking about the fact that man sacrifices his health in order to make money, and then sacrifices his money in order to make himself healthy. And we're just anxious about the future. We're not really living. And we live like, you know, as if we're never going to die. And we end up not really ever being present, not really living in the here and now. And I think in order to be creative, we kind of have to step off that the endless treadmill of life and be present in the moment, and ask ourselves, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And then the fourth sort of major step for me, I think, is you know, to be able to enter that creative zone is I had to become really fluent in the language that I was working in. So really fluent in Rebetiko. I really needed to understand how the music works and the constructive constraints that, you know, guide my creativity. If we have time, I'd love to share a couple of these constraints. We have, do I have time to do that, Adam? Of the sort of the musical.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
All right, talk for the next hour. No, but I wanted to share some of the sort of musical nuts and bolts, so that it's more than just sort of, you know, theoretical. But you know, when I sit down to improvise in Rebetiko, there are these constraints that help me. I'm not just playing anything. And so one of these constraints is a musical mode. So every Rebetiko song is written in what is called a musical mode. And this is basically, it's very similar to raga. It's a group of notes that, and also some sort of accompanying characteristics and that sort of tell you something about the personality of these notes and how you can sort of move back and forth between the notes. So what exactly does that mean? Well, an example, I have my trusty bouzouki here, so you believe that I've not just been making this up. But so an example of a mode, right? This is mode Hijaz. So it's a group of 8 notes you have here. Okay, so D, E flat, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, D. Right, so that's the group of notes. And you know that if, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to improvise in mode Hijaz, those are the notes I'm going to use. So already there's a sort of a constructive constraint there, but those are the notes I'm allowed to use. What else do I know about the mode Hijaz? I know that there are certain notes in that mode that are more important than others, that you should spend more time on those notes. So for example, in Hijaz, if you look at the notes that are in red, the D, the G, and the A are the really important ones. So I would spend a lot of time on the D, I might jump up to the GA. Spend a really long time. So again, another constructive constraint. I know that there's certain chords that are appropriate to play. So what if you want to add in other notes, like a D chord, right? Or a G chord. Like there are certain chords that are appropriate. You can add in other notes. They're called chromaticisms. You can sort of sneak in a G sharp sometimes, or sneak in a C sharp and expand your palette of notes. I also know that in mode Hijaz, usually when you start improvisation, you're supposed to start somewhere down here on the lower end, and you kind of travel up, and then you travel back down. So there is this kind of a creative map that the more you get to know, and this is just one mode, right? But the more you get to know how the modes work, it sort of creates a zone of comfort, or sort of like a safety net for you, that, you know, if I just stay within these rules, this might not be a moment of extraordinary musical genius, but what is going to come out is going to be new, it's going to be my own, and it's going to be intelligible to my audience. And then, you know, because this is Rebettica, it's not bluegrass, it's not classical music, it's not Carnatic music, there are certain sort of stylistic constraints as well. I made a list here, there's no reason to go through them, but the way in which I approach different notes, you know, the sort of the style in which I play these notes, again, serves as a kind of safety net or constraint. So, for example, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth one down, syncopated repetition of a note, really, really common in Rebettica. If you're playing like A, not just to play A, but to play short, long, short, long. So like adding in these also little stylistic constraints. And in a sense, you know, this is what I meant before when I said something about, you know, creative mapping, kind of understanding the palette of possibilities, and then having in my mind sort of a general structure of, okay, this is how the improvisation is going to go. And maybe it'll be brilliant, and maybe it won't be. But as Ranjan said, I'm not, you know, throwing away my house or something. So I think working within the confines of kind of safety, I guess, is the word for it, frees me to be creative. I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. You know, I love this idea of learning the palette of possibilities, right? And I think that ties in really nicely with a lot of what the other panelists have said today. Of, as your understanding of your domain becomes more sophisticated, you can become more creative. And so in improvisation, it's quite literal, right? Like you not only have to learn the names of the notes in the mode, but you have to learn how people have used them in the past, right? Which is a lot more slippery of a bit of knowledge, and requires a lot more experience. I think that's really super interesting. Thank you. So I could ask a million more questions about that, but we're quickly approaching an hour. So I would like to move into the last phase of this talk. And again, the panelists are free to interpret this question as they would like, but I will read it to you all in the form that I gave it to them. So the last question is, what does it mean to finish a creative product? Thinking on your own creative experiences, when do you know you're on the right track to finish a creative process? Can you recognize a moment when things seem to start to come together? How much of the work you do during the creative process ends up as part of the final product? How much of it is tossed aside, and how do you know when you are done? And let's see, Amy, do you want to start this one?
Yes, I will start. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a bit about this website I did. So here, let me screen share so it's funner to look at. So this came from an animation I was working on. Just a second. It came from a 2D animation I was collaborating on it was for Super Deluxe, for this sort of Adult Swim type thing. I was working with someone, and collaborations are hard. They became very set in a certain way of doing it. And I realized that, and at the time, it wasn't worth sort of banging my head against the wall. And I was just very aware of like, where do I want to put my energy into, my creative energy into trying to convince someone to do something the way I want to do it, or just leave it alone and put it somewhere else. And it was this feeling of like sadness at the idea of, I'd been so excited. I'd thought of all these characters, all these possibilities. And it was almost like a little embryo in me of this creative energy, and I couldn't let it go. So I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna develop a website based off of this animation. It was a mystery that took place in a dance club. So I made a fake website for the dance club, and it was sort of a way to put my creativity somewhere, but also a way to explore different ways of narrative and world building. A lot of ways we tell stories now and ingest stories is multi-platform, Twitter, drama feed channels on YouTube, news feeds, Instagram, that sort of thing. And you're keeping up with it on different areas. So I just want to explore that. So I developed this. There's all of these inside jokes that relate to things in the story. There's the Tsar, which is the son of the bar owner, who's very sketchy, who has a jean company. And then so when you click on this, you see it's been taken over by the FBI. Everything was sort of written in this sort of trashy, campy style, which is like the animation. Here you can see the actual original animation. And then this here. So I wanted to create live action versions of the cartoon characters for fun, really. And then I wondered, what was the point of doing all that? I could do it in Photoshop. And so I thought of videos, and then I thought of webcam girls and webcam shows. So use that sort of format to create these interactive, sorry, the sound can be loud sometimes. These interactive videos. So you can see for all of them there, it's about like 10 videos each for each one. And it was just like a nice loose style to develop it. And just using sort of all the mistakes of media as artist material, like bad sound, glitches when streaming slows down and then speeds up. And then so I released it. And some people saw it, some people were into it, but again, I had this just sort of energy. And again, maybe it's the hoarder in me, but I didn't want to let it go yet. I wasn't done with it. So I created an Instagram account where I had really short videos with captions sort of as memes. I developed a t-shirt for it. The voice actor on this, she created a installation at the Austin Contrast Film Festival. So it's like a one-night event, which was like a recreation. I brought some costumes down and we had the characters in these little sets sort of thing. And it was really about feeling like I could put it to bed and that I was just done with it. And I feel like now I think I'm done with it. I still love this project, but I think I started it in like 2017 or something like that. But it was a lot about just having this ball of creativity, not wanting to let it die or be defeated in a sense. So finding another place to put it. And then a lot of my work is just finding fun ways to play with art and commerce, like merchandise, creating merch, creating different ways to disseminate it. So I just tried, and opportunities I would try to fit this project into it. So it was almost, like just doing, using it until I was done, like I was done with it and felt like, okay, I got enough out of this little baby. Can put it to bed.
Do you think you could explain what does it feel like to be done? Because it sounds like the way you're describing this project, it sounds like you could you could keep adding to it for the rest of your life. So what do you mean that it felt
I thought
like
of a great answer. It's depressing. but oftentimes when I'll have a project, it's like when you finish it, it's often just really depressing because the ship you were sailing on is over. That thing that had given you purpose is gone, and you no longer have something to focus on. So I'll usually work on smaller projects and bigger projects while I do it. But now I'm feeling sort of satisfied and calm about it, and just sort of like enough eyes have been on it. So I think that's good. And I think I don't know, like I think it's sort of intuitively with the comic I was working on, I started with one commission to create one chapter. And then I just built it up with just simple narrative things like heightening and just recreating that narrative arc of like, and then, so just like pushing it so it fit this sort of amusement ride of a story. But yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Haichi, it seems to me that this question would be especially difficult for someone in your field to answer. Like, is the work of discovering new math, like, can that ever end?
Well, I want to share my screen this time. Can you see that? Well, firstly, I did not ask for your wise approval before this, but in the spirit of this panel discussion, I create something which try to answer that question. Is for us, in a sense, it's kind of easy to answer because when I publish a paper, it is a stop. But what kind of stop is that? Is that a stop that is that long? Is that just a stop of a long journey, or is that a long pause that I don't know when I'm going to come back? And so it's sometime sometime I do think that once maybe it's a chapter, I can close a chapter when I get the paper published. But then I want to maybe sometime I choose to distance myself from that project for a while, so that if I am going to come back, I can, I can feel it again. I can re-engage with it again, and so that's it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Yona, you've already kind of talked on this idea of finishing, right? It sounds to me like in your work, the finish is somewhat built in. Is that right?
I guess so. I mean, it's a really hard question for me to speak to, actually. I in a sense, once you played an improvisation and it's over, then it's over. The moment has passed, it's done. But in another sense, it's never complete because you'll always go back to the next jazz improvisation and you're still drawing from the same sort of stockpile of knowledge, and you're trying a new path, a new structure, kind of like Haichi's reworking of that art drawing there with the ant. And so I think what I can sort of speak to is how do I know whether an improvisation was a success rather than necessarily finished. And so I think just a couple of things. I think the purpose of the improvisation is important. So, why did I create it? Why was I being creative? Was I playing in the context of a dance club, and did I get, people up and dancing out of their seats? Am I playing for people who are sitting quietly? Am I playing for myself? All improvisations aren't equal. And so I think the reason why I improvised, it plays a big role in whether something has been whether it's been a success. Also, I think audience feedback is key. If there is an audience, Rebetiko audiences they're responsive. If they like what you do, they'll call out to you and you'll know it. And if they don't, you'll also know it. They might just talk through your entire performance or, smirk or whatever. So I think audience feedback plays into my own perception. And then I think finally, it's also just my own improvisation experience. Why does anybody participate in making art of any kind? We're not bound to become famous or wealthy, most of us, from our art. And I think it's, personal fulfillment. And I think if I've managed to achieve that, I don't know if Marcel is still here, but what he talked about, that state of flow in our previous panel discussion, being in a state of flow, sort of being in this kind of trance-like altered state of total absorption where, time just kind of seems to disappear and I forget myself, and I'm challenged enough so I feel like this is really enjoyable, but I'm not so challenged that I'm freaking out and lose sense of what I'm doing. If I manage to be in a state of flow, and I managed to do that while still staying within the creative constraints of Rebettica, then I think that was a success, and I think that improvisation, I think it's done. So that's what I would say to that.
Wonderful. Ranjan, do you want to bring us to a conclusion?
Yeah. So creative activity does not have an end product. Creativity can be abandoned. Creative products can be abandoned, and creative products can die. But you're not done, because when you go back to your definition of creativity, you're talking about something new, novel, and something useful. If that usefulness is not there, that means audience is not appreciating anymore the same thing, then it's dead. But if that kind of improvisation is still being cherished and appreciated, and that kind of creates that process of further doing it. Same thing with art too, and I have in my file drawer maybe more 20 papers that are abandoned. Ideas are tossed out. So I've created, but there's no audience for it, at least in my mind. So once there's an audience, once that utility is established, then we can say there's a culmination of that process, essentially. And as long as that usefulness is perceived and still alive, that creative product lives. Otherwise, it dies. I mean, there are a lot of products. Segway. You've seen that thing. That is like an amazing creation. It died. It's used only in some places. It's not there anymore. So I don't think creative people, or at least in my view, everybody is involved in creative thinking. There's a word called jugaad in our language, means bricolage, essentially, putting things together with what you have. We engage that all the time. When we are fixing dinner, we can be creative. Many people are creative. Some people are recipe bound. So, and once you finish eating that, you probably won't create your end. You're not going to make the same thing again, because the material in your refrigerator and cupboards are different, essentially, right? So you'll create something new. So they could be fleeting in terms of their lifespan. They could die, they could be abandoned, or they could live for a long time. And I don't think the pieces that you hear from the classical musicians, that creative products are just being used to create some routines, to learn, but not to create new products, essentially. Or maybe that could be an inspiration to create new product, but they're not eternal, let's put it that way. That's my view.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you all so much. This was, I had no idea what it was going to be, because it's we're talking about creativity, and creativity, as we have figured out, is unpredictable. But I want to thank all four of you for your incredibly thoughtful answers and thinking through what I know were not particularly easy questions to think about. And I would love to open this up to our audience members if anyone has questions or comments or things they would like to mention.
Hey, Adam, I just want to thank, because I was not supposed to be on this panel, but I'm grateful that I'm on it, and I enjoyed the time, and I appreciate you inviting me, and I loved sharing my views. Thank you.
Yeah, we loved having you. Thank you. Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? Did we successfully define creativity tonight? Is that what happened?
Yeah, it's done. It's over. We're good.
Hey, Adam.
Hey, Marcel.
Yeah, it's Marcel. I do have a question. I was wondering what role emotion played in creativity for the panelists. So emotion as an antecedent to creativity, emotional feelings in maybe peak creative experiences, and then emotion as a consequence of creativity. And there were some really good, vivid, emotion-based words that the panelists used: fun, safe, terrifying, things like that. And so, we're emotional creatures, and I just kind of wonder what role the panelists feel like emotion plays in their creative process.
I can say positive emotions are, a positive antecedent for creative work. Negative emotions typically, curb any creative work, and not just negative emotions that come from within yourself, but also negative emotions that you're subjected to. That could be possible. And I still remember once having a conversation with an artist saying that, hey, all these great jazz musicians, they seem depressed or they're on drugs and all of that stuff. How do they create all this stuff? The response was, have you ever considered that they want to actually block off all the negativity and they just live with their positive, self? I said, wow, that's interesting.
I mean, I think for me, emotion is a huge, enormous factor. Both thinking back to our previous panel on performance anxiety, I think a lot of what I do is sort of getting in the creative zone, is also learning to manage my sort of fear of having the spotlight on me and people staring at me and not having a script, which I'm used to having a score in front of me and just playing, right? And then I also think there's the unbelievable high that comes when you play and you play well. I mean, there have been studies that note the physiological changes that come when you're in the zone and when you have a great performance. And so I don't know if it's adrenaline or what exactly is happening there, but I think that's one of the greatest feelings, is when I've had a great moment on stage like that. So that's what I would say.
Well, I think that's a great question, because I think creativity is a long process. To me, it has, a whole range of emotion coming with it. It's just that kind of craving to create is like trying to get high. But there are a lot of time in that long process. Adam, second question about that process to bring it to fruition. That process could be not fun. It could be very defeating, at times, and sometimes, even when the process is coming to a stop, it could bring some, a sense of satisfaction, but at the same time, it could feel pretty sad because it's over. You started again.
I think also thank you, Hachi. The way that I use emotion in mine for a sadder twist, but it's a great way to just process sort of negative emotion and that sort of thing. I think a lot of storytelling, it just provides this, you can create this paradigm and this visual language and this sort of logic to it that allows you to abstract things enough that you can focus on bigger ideas rather than the pettiness, like power structure, power dynamics, games humans play to deal with their emotions, reality, stuff like that. And there was something else I was gonna say, but I forgot. Yep.
Thank you so
Oh
much.
yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I never. That it said that animation is a translation of observed reality. So I feel like a lot of art, in a way, is translating a specifics of an experience, like of a perceived reality. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We have two hands up, and I don't know the order that they went up. Lynn, would you like to ask your question?
Well, I was going to say I was the second hand up, in case you want to.
The other one was my wife, so she.
Wait a minute. Are you? No priority for family members. Great. Okay. So first of all, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for putting this together. And I was so intrigued by the sort of different domains that people were talking about. And Adam, you started out by saying that you think in the arts, we kind of put creativity and genius up on some kind of a scary pedestal, and in ways that can sometimes be counterproductive for many of us, right? And I was thinking math famously is an area where people talk about some of the same things, So I was really glad to see that combination, arts, business, math, whereas in business, Ranjan, I think that, gosh, right now, everything's innovation. you know? It's become such a buzzword. You're like, right, we're innovating, you know? But so what I was wondering about is I think you've all been very effective at taking that creativity down from the scary pedestal and thinking about it as a process, and as a process that involves learning and the palette of possibilities that that Yona was talking about, and then this scary journey with a lot of uncertainty and so forth. And I found myself wondering, where does education fit into this picture, or social support and collaboration of any kind? Because I think one piece of the pedestal is we picture the innovators and the creative people as working all by themselves. And I'm curious to know what the, well, I know, Yona, I think you're playing with an ensemble, right? So I'd love to hear the panelists talk about that aspect, the collaborative aspect.
I can just briefly say that without collaboration, innovation cannot happen. And without interdisciplinary collaboration, innovation will never be effective. And without having some inclination and interest towards an art, whether it is music, drawing, poetry, writing novels, without an inclination to try even those, you will never be able to be effective in innovation. You may be able to put some things together once in a while, but that appreciation is very important. And that's why I keep having long discussions with Adam saying that, why is arts not part of, entrepreneurship? That is the fundamental area for, anyhow, that's collaboration is extremely important.
Well, I guess collaboration in math or in science, for me, at least for me, I think is great to, be around with other people who are passionate about the same thing. And so, I mean, if personally, I think I always learn something new when I'm around with other people, like all of you today, learn new things. I think learn new things is a way, I get inspired to do, creative work. Yeah. But I think it's a good question.
I just forgot a piece of thought when you mentioned, Lynn, education, right? So how about we have a system, a university where every liberal arts major should have a minor in a professional or business, and vice versa. A business major has to have a minor in liberal arts or arts, performing arts, and all this stuff. Imagine the kind of products that you're going to produce, the kind of students that you're going to produce. They're going to be superheroes, essentially.
It's funny because I feel like I'm the arty one, but in speaking to you, I'm almost like, oh my God, I feel like my students or our mode of teaching feels like almost the most uptight in a way, because I'm teaching at a animation school and it's very sort of industry oriented, and that's something I struggle with a lot. So even in the arts, like you're trying to give training, give people skills, but I had a student just talking in class like, oh my God, I'm taking this process oriented class and we just get to make stuff, and it's what a great break from the grind. And it's something I've just been struggling with, like how to teach creativity or encourage them to trust themselves and create that space to be creative, as well as stick to a deadline, make a portfolio, get a job, all of this stuff that can just, loom on you. But yeah. And the collaboration part, it's funny because I, as an animator too, has a reputation of being very controlling, moving all the little things around. So often with my work, it'll be a switch between the two, where I'll be alone, sort of controlling my world, and then collaborations provide this really great sort of energy bouncing off people, but force myself to give up control and sort of, surf more and ride that, ride it out, have faith in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add, obviously we have this idea sort of the lone genius musician, sort of just writing music or pounding away at the piano. And, and a lot of the hours that I spend are hours that are, very alone and working at my instrument. But there's sort of a lot of conversation going on, even, you know, listening to recordings, listening to what other people have done. But, you know, I think to sort of borrow language maybe from the business world, I think there's different kinds of things that we do, even when we're improvising, that are always in relation to other people, what other people have done. So, you know, there's this idea of kind of imitative improvisation where you're imitating what others have done. So musically, I'm incorporating, you know, chunks of phrases that other people have played or imitating their style. And then there's kind of reactive improvisation where I'm reacting to what I've just played or I've just done or what somebody else has done and being more in the moment. And then there's this idea of, you know, generative improvisation where I'm actively daring to take risks and do something new. So I think every note that is played is always in conversation in some way with what has been done before and what has not yet been done. And then I think to speak to that question about education, you know, for this particular musical tradition, the way that I learned was by sitting amongst a group of Rebetiko musicians, and nobody really explained very much to me, but it was a particular kind of education. It's sort of like, you know, Indonesian gamelan, where you sit down and you start to play and you kind of figure it out as you go. So very, very sort of collaborative idea of how you learn. And maybe that slowed me down a little bit in a sense, because I had to kind of go back and try to figure out the music theory as I tried to explain before. But yeah, absolutely, collaboration. That was a great question. Thank you for that.
I love the idea of improv as collaboration with people from the past and the future. It's such a cool idea.
Unless you're not very good at it like me, then nobody wants to converse with you.
You know, I'll add too that one of the things that I have learned about education through learning more about creativity itself is that one way to view education is it's the data that you're going to put in your mind to be able to do the tasks in your life. And that's fine, but it's also very limiting. The other way to look at education is it's the data that you're going to use as a body to create new knowledge, right? And so this plays into this idea of understanding the palette of possibilities. When we're getting an education, we're putting knowledge into our minds that we can then use as a possibility to create new knowledge. And so that's been a really, for me, a very important and very moving realization too. And it makes me want to do nothing except learn more and more, because if it's just expanding the palette of possibilities, then why wouldn't you want to expand it even wider, you know? I've tried explaining that to my students, and they didn't really seem to get it the same way I do. Naghmeh, did you have a comment?
Yeah, first of all, this was an amazing group of people to listen to talk about their process. It was kind of explained about the process of creativity, that it's a very long process. There's lots of ups and downs, and some of you explained it as surfing, some explained it as being in the stormy ocean, and we also heard some about how the process is finished when it comes to an end. But what happens in the process, in the middle of the process? Do you ever take pauses? And if you do, why that happens? Why do you pause? Or do you start the process and you continue to get to the result that you are satisfied before you stop?
Naghmeh, firstly, I want to say I'm sorry I didn't ask for permission to modify your artwork.
You're all good. I'm happy that you liked it.
To answer a question, I usually take long pause. For me, there was one project that it took me more than 8 years. I started, 8 or 9 years ago, actually 10 years ago, I started, the initial phase, I did it very fast within a month, but then I realized that's not what I want to answer. And then I somehow, it was the process was too tedious. So I put it aside, not until, a couple years ago. Like occasionally I go back and forth, but it was so tedious. So I just put it aside, and wait for a long time until it, finally come together. There was an occasion there was also an occasion to present the results, so it pushed me to finish it. But I take long pause. That's a quick answer. Long pause.
I've been working on a film. Not me, no, I'm working on asking you for advice, but I've been working on it for over 10 years, and I think that I've never been able to just sort of cross into the creation stage because I was too precious about it. Like I was just too attached to the idea being really good, and I feel like I just wasn't emotionally there to write the characters with enough depth. But I feel a lot of it was just like I was just too uptight and precious, and it's almost taking me this long to just not care about the idea and be tired of it to be like, okay, now I can do it.
You know, there's this famous quotation, Rabindranath Tagore, spring has passed, summer has gone, winter is here, and the song that I meant to sing remains unsung, for I have spent my days stringing and unstringing my instrument. So what you just said reminded me of that quite a bit. I come from a world of classical music where you're taught if you take a day off from practicing, you lose 2 weeks of your progress, right? There's this pressure, practice every single day, 4 hours and never stop. You know, I stuck to that for quite some years. It gives you carpal tunnel and all kinds of other things. In the world of, you know, Rebettica improvisation, no, I absolutely take breaks. I think you can play an improvisation and it doesn't go well and it can be frustrating and sort of, you kind of lose your oomph, your enthusiasm a little bit for the project. I think taking breaks is sort of healthy. Sometimes, you know, you step away for a little bit and you come back to that same Hijaz mode and you sort of look at it with fresh eyes, kind of like looking at a book or a project or something you've been working on for too long and you need to take a minute away. Yeah, absolutely taking breaks as much as I try to be diligent every day. But
yeah, I think when you take a product approach or a project approach, yes, all of these apply. But if you're not deliberately thinking creatively, or at least, you know, viewing different aspects of your life creatively, or at least practicing that, you would have problems, I think, you know. Or if you conform to authority and, you know, give yourself up completely to the authority, even for a few days, and not question authority, I think you won't be able to get back to your creative product. I mean, I'm using authority in a very general sense. So.
Thank you.
I guess also emotion play a role. Sometimes it's fear and frustration in that process. Maybe a good idea, when it comes, it feels great, but that process, the whole process is full of frustration and fears. That, you know, that make me sometimes walk away from it so I can, you know, have a fresh start, you know.
I think Helena had something, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say we had a question from Helena.
First I want to say that I really enjoyed listening. And my question was, what is the relationship between past and new creative projects? And how do you know when to diverge from previous experience or methods?
I can speak to that a bit. So I feel like with my work, I kind of have an underlying concept of DIY, playing with different structures to disseminate work. But within that, I am always trying to just challenge myself and keep it interesting and keep myself on my toes, and like that true experimentation where you don't know if you can really do it or if it's going to work out by just using new software and new approaches. So I think part of my thing is always moving and changing and not wanting to get stuck in remaking the same thing over and over.
I think, Helena, what you're referring to is a paradox, essentially. So if ideas come from your past knowledge, you know, and if new ideas are supposed to be rooted in old knowledge, then how can they be novel, right? So it's a paradox, in my view. It's not about recognizing whatever idea you have is coming from your old knowledge. Obviously, it comes from those structures, cognitive structures, essentially. But whether or not you are willing to combine two seemingly opposite pieces of knowledge. Can I do this? It's not allowed. Can I try that? That's when something novel will emerge. Until then, nothing novel will emerge, in my view. To challenge something, that's when you know that you're on the path of doing something new. If it is creative and successful, that all depends, on how others perceive it, essentially.
I think I would also add sort of the emotional component to it. Maybe it's just because I'm a musician or dealing with music, but I think the second that something doesn't speak to me anymore, it's not fulfilling emotionally, it's not making me happy, it's not, in a sense, I was a classical violinist, and I love playing, of course, but there was something about Greek folk music, about this Rebetiko genre, that spoke to me so much more deeply, that it kind of caused me to sort of leave one world behind, a musical world, and really veer somewhere else into a completely different sound world and emotional world. And so I think that's sort of key. I think we, as Marcel said earlier, we are emotional beings, and that's sort of the heart of what we do, even if we're very cerebral and intellectual about our work. And if that sort of passion, if the flame goes out for some reason, for me personally, I leave it alone. Let somebody else pick up who's feeling as passionate as I used to about whatever that was.
Well, Hannah, I think that's a great question. Maybe in math, it's more well-defined, part of the creative process is to first, see what have been done. And I would say sometimes even just for my own sake of enjoyment, to recreate what has been done is very fulfilling, talking about the emotional components. Because for me, if I'm learning something, if I'm not happy, I know I will never make something new. And so, it's a struggle sometimes, well, but I think that's a great question. Yeah.
Well, we have approached the 1.5 hour mark, and I think we probably have all had our brains stuffed with plenty of things to think on for the next 30 or 40 years. I want to once again, seriously, from the bottom of my heart, I thank all of the panelists. I know that I asked really hard questions. It's very difficult to think about your own process, and I sincerely appreciate all the effort you put into your answers. And this has just it's been a lot of fun for me. So I'll offer up a virtual round of applause, and we'll conclude it there.
And
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Great night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Adam, you put into a lot